Xin chào. Thank you for coming. So my name is Chris Morrison. I'm the founder of a small company called Chronicle Games. It's only existed for a few months now. My background before that is that I was a lead designer for a company in San Francisco, California called Mixer. And before that, I worked for an outsourcing company that worked with a lot of different clients in gaming. So most of my experience has been with games in pre-production, especially prototyping and making sure that the game will be fun and be good. So today I'm going to talk about prototyping specifically for mobile games. So I'll talk about three things. One is more about what prototyping in general is, not just for mobile games. The second is how prototyping has changed versus the past, because that's a very important part of what prototyping is for mobile games. What's different about prototyping for mobile versus prototyping for AAA games or for computer games. And last, I'll talk about some tips I have for prototypers. So, what is gameplay prototyping? If I was to try to explain gameplay prototyping to somebody who didn't know at all what it was, I would say it's just testing ideas. And every industry, besides gaming, also has something similar to this. For instance, in television, if somebody has an idea for a show, they don't go make the entire show. They make one episode cheaply, quickly, and then see if the idea works. So for games, it's very similar. We just test out an idea with a small version of the game. It's about answering a question. So a question might be, I want to make a pinball game, and I have an idea that in the pinball game, I want the ball to cause damage to things in the game. Is that fun? Maybe. So you find the fun, and the last point is to fail as quickly as possible. So the idea here is that in games, we all know, most games fail. So you want to prove whether or not you're going to fail with your prototype very early as possible. Some companies don't actually prototype at all. Some companies just have a game designer who writes a document. They give the document to executives. The executives say, oh, it looks cool, let's make it. Then they spend 6 months or a year or 2 years making the game. They never test it out. And then sometimes the game succeeds, sometimes they waste lots of money and 2 years of time. With a document, you can never know, is the game going to be successful? Is it going to be fun? With a presentation, you can never know if the game is successful or fun. With a prototype, you can know. You can see, you've tested it, and you can see if it's fun. So these are some examples of games that were very heavily prototyped. The companies put a lot of time to prototyping. Of all the companies that I know of, most of the best companies spend a lot of time working on prototypes. So this is a version of Plants vs. Zombies. You can see the art is a little ugly compared to the game that you might have played. This company, PopCap, prototypes every game that they do. And for Plants vs. Zombies, they prototype a lot. Super Mario 64, you all know Nintendo. Nintendo is also very famous for prototyping. And then, does anybody know World of Goo? No? It's famous in the United States. This game sold maybe 6 or 7 million copies, but it started as a prototype, one week prototype, and then they found it was so fun that they wanted to make the full game. More recent, these two companies, you guys know Candy Crush Saga, and then also Clash of Clans, Hay Day. These are successful here, right? These companies invest also lots in prototyping. King.com, they have over 150 games. They test on their website. If the game is good on their website, then they put more time in. So far, only 3 games they put on mobile, and then 1 is very successful, Candy Crush. And then Supercell, they don't say how many prototypes they do, but they start with mini games and then narrow it down. So far, just 2 games. Who prototypes? So this is an important question for a company that wants to prototype. Is it the engineer, the artist, or a game designer? To me, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who prototypes. The only thing we need is somebody who can make a game, a simple game. So for the engineer, the problem is that with engineer, a lot of the times the engineer wants to prototype something besides the game. They want to have the game that has the best performance, that runs the fastest, that has a cool idea for engineering. Don't let them. Make them prototype gameplay. The artist wants to draw pretty pictures, but they need to just focus on gameplay. And game designers, we just get drunk and write a document. So, what is mobile prototyping? These are the things that have changed that make mobile prototyping very different from if Nintendo was doing it 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, what people would do. The big thing for mobile is how long you spend prototyping. For AAA games, for console games, the time could be from 3 months to, I've heard of 2 years spent just prototyping a game. For mobile, I think the time is 3 days to 30 days. And I have a reason for 3 days. I go to a lot of game jams. In a game jam, they give you 2 days. Each team gets 2 days to build a game. And 2 days is usually just enough to complete if you work 12 hours a day for 2 days. So for normal prototyping, I think 3 days you can get a good prototype. 1 month is like the maximum. I would never go above a month for a prototype for a mobile game. Maybe 1 week, 2 weeks. Try not to get too much into it. There's a reason we can spend a short amount of time prototyping. I'm 32 years old now, and I remember 20 years ago trying to build games when I was a kid. It was really hard. The technology was hard. Using computers was hard. Everything was hard. Today, technology has become very easy, especially for just prototyping a game. We have really good engines. We have better coding languages. We have good online help. And computing power is basically unlimited for a prototype. We can make really bad decisions in building a prototype. And it's okay. So here's an example of all the engines that you can use just for mobile prototyping. There's several for 3D prototyping. There's a whole bunch for 2D prototyping. Personally, I use Unity a lot. I use GameMaker. Most of these, you can build a full game. They're very powerful. But you can also use them for prototyping. And it's very easy for most of them. So when you go to this list, and you look and you say, what will I use to prototype? The way to make a decision on a tool to prototype with is to just look at the engine and decide, are there released games that look good? Is there documentation? Are there plugins that you can use? The point is to find something that you can work with very, very quickly, because you don't want to waste any time. You don't want to spend 3 days learning an engine and learning how the engine can do something. You want to start on day 1 and be finished by day 3, or be finished by day 5. Team size is different. When I'm working for a client, a lot of times I work alone by myself. Because I don't need to have every capability, I just need to be good enough. Basically good enough for a few things. I think a very good team for mobile prototyping is 1 game designer, 1 engineer, 2 people. Once you get to 3 people, 5 people, every new person slows down the team. So keep the team small if possible. And the last thing that's very different about prototyping now is the philosophy, what people expect. So these companies like Supercell, like King.com, like Valve, like Nintendo, they all have the same idea in their head about prototyping, which is that it's okay to fail. If you have somebody prototype a game and they fail, don't fire them. Have them build another prototype and another until you find a successful game. A lot of companies don't understand the idea of allowing yourself to fail, and you get games like these. Just these 4 games, they wasted something like $250 million US, maybe 300, 400 people working on these games that had not been prototyped very well. A lot of failures like this could be avoided. And mobile games, you don't waste so much, but still, it's better not to fail like this. So, tips for prototypers. One big thing that people wonder about prototypes is how much art should I do? You remember the Plants vs. Zombies picture earlier? This is the first prototype. It's really, really ugly, right? It looks awful. But the reason is that they don't care. Art does not matter to them. They just want to prototype, is it fun? At Nintendo, Shigeru Miyamoto, the guy who makes Mario and Donkey Kong, he says, I don't care about art, make it ugly. Make it as ugly as possible, and we'll just test the fun. Later, do the art. But there is one kind of art that matters, and that's art that lets you give feedback, lets players know what's happening. So we call this being juicy in English, but it's the same idea anywhere. When you play Fruit Ninja, things explode. When you play Candy Crush Saga, there's numbers and particle effects and things flying around. You know that you're playing a game. This is really important for prototyping as well. With a prototype, you want players to know when they do something, what they did, and why it's important. So this is similar to art, and it's worth spending time on in a prototype. So an example of having something be juicy. The problem with juicy is it takes time, and you don't want to spend time. So for me, I say to myself all the time, be lazy, be more lazy. So this is pseudocode example of something I do to be lazy. I take one piece of code and I copy it over and over and over and over again. With this one piece of code, it's something that makes an object get bigger, get smaller. That's all. It just makes it get bigger or smaller. But if I put this code together, time after time, I can produce different effects for it. You can have a confirm effect where it goes big, small, or notice me, pulsates. Every time you can reuse something you did before, you save 30 minutes, you save an hour. So remember to be lazy and reuse. A very famous game designer said once about prototyping, if it takes less than 2 days, just do it. Don't think, just do it. For me, I'd say for mobile prototyping, if it takes less than 2 hours, do it. I think for me, I have a to-do list of items. Do this, do this, do this, do this. I prioritize my list by how long things take. If it takes 1 hour, just put it at the top. There's a very good reason to be lazy about doing faster things first. And that's, you get unexpected results. So, an example from a prototype I did, the game idea was to track down a monster that's walking around. So, I knew some different ways to make the monster walk. You can have something called A-star pathfinding. So you say, go there, and it finds a way there. Or I could sit there and build a path for the monster. But these things were going to take me a couple hours, and I didn't want to. It was lazy. So I found, I'm sorry, it's a problem in there, but I found a really easy, stupid way to do it. It was the stupidest way I could think of. And that was just that the monster would walk around randomly until he reached a point. It took me 15 minutes. But it turned out that that was fun. To have the monster wandering around like a drunken idiot was fun. It gave you lots of room to walk around after. Another example of why to be lazy is the game Populous. Does anybody know Populous? It's like a God game. You play God, one person. The person who made that game is Peter Molyneux. He's a very famous game designer. He's like me. I'm a bad engineer. He's a bad engineer. When he was making Populous, he said, I want the people to walk from here to there, but here is a mountain. And I'm too dumb to make them walk around the mountain. I don't know how. So instead of having the character walk around the mountain, I'll let the player make the mountain go down. It's a really stupid solution. But it turns out that that's the whole game of Populous. You make terrain go up, go down. And it's fun. It's really fun. But he would never know if he hadn't been lazy. When you're lazy, when you try things out that are simple, you find unexpected fun. One thing that's really important for a touchscreen, like an iPhone or any Android, is to think a lot about touch controls. Most game developers still think about console games or computer games when they make games. So they make they make controls that are similar to those games. But the best games, the most successful games, have been games with simple interaction. So this is one thing to focus on prototyping for mobile. Tiny Wings, for instance, he found a way to make the whole game be controlled by one tap. You tap anywhere on the whole screen, and you just tap sometimes. Just tap, and it happens, and then you watch, and then it goes and flies, and you tap again later. For Nimble Quest, it's just a swipe. This is also a pretty good game. Very similar to your touch control scheme is how quickly players can react. So for a computer game or a PlayStation game, you have very fast reaction times from players. They can hit 10 buttons in 2 seconds, especially if you're playing Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, a racing game. You hit buttons very, very quickly. And when people make games for touchscreen, they still think about a controller. They still think about a keyboard or a mouse. These two games, Super Hexagon and Jetpack Joyride, are two of the fastest moving games for mobile. So you can study these games to find out how fast can players move. It turns out not very fast. You tap maybe once a second. Every time you tap, your thumb covers the screen. You can't see what you're doing. So worry about these things when you prototype for mobile. Think about, how will I figure out how to be slower, how to have the player touch the screen less, how to make it simpler for the player. And those are very good things to test out with prototyping because they are simple tests. Another important thing for a prototyper is to just know about a lot of games. So when a vice president comes up to you and says, hey, can you do this idea that I had? You can say, well, another game did that 7 years ago for Game Boy Advance, and it was horrible. It was an awful idea, so we can just skip that one. Or you can say, another game did that and it was fun, and I'll copy that mechanic and use that in my prototype. The more games you know, the better. Before I was a game designer, I worked with this company, AppData. I was an analyst and I studied different games on Facebook. And I was a journalist before that, so I have a wide selection of different games in my memory. And that's been one of the most helpful things to me in prototyping. One of the last points about prototyping in general is to find your toy. So this game is a strategy game. I think of it as kind of Asian style, although it's by a German company. This game probably has 500 features. It's just packed. It's got everything in the world. So if you tried to prototype a game with 1,000 features, obviously you can't do it in 3 days. You can't do it in a week or a month. You probably can't do it in a year. So when you prototype, you want to think about what is the toy inside of my game. So when I study that game, there is one screen where you battle with other people. And within that screen, there's this row on the bottom of buttons. The buttons are the cards. That's your toy. And if you were prototyping this game, that is the prototype you would make, not all the rest, not the trading and the shop and the lottery game and all the other stuff that's in it. Just this, you prove this is fun. And this, by the way, is not a very good game, but this part of the game is good, so it does have players. I'll use Nintendo as an example again, because Nintendo, I think, is one of the best game companies in the world. And they've always had this idea that you find the toy first. So when they did Super Mario 64, it was one of the first 3D platforming games. Nobody knew how to do 3D platforming because it just had never been done. So they said, first, prototype the toy of Mario jumping. Once you get every kind of jump, then you can move to the next step, prototype the camera. Once you can jump and the camera is good, then the game is done. All you have to do is build levels and build art and build the rest. But if this is fun, the game is complete. So they spent 2 years doing this. And then once this was complete, they built the rest and it was one of the most successful games ever. And the last point I'll make about prototyping is the same one I've said before. Be unafraid to fail. This game is Little Inferno. I don't know if anybody's ever played, but in Little Inferno, you burn things. You burn everything. Just throw it in and it catches on fire and burns. When a company prototypes, they should think of prototyping like this. If it doesn't work, burn it. If it doesn't seem fun in some way, burn it, get rid of it, throw it away. And don't feel bad, don't feel like the team is failing. Just let it burn and move on to the next thing. That's I think the single most important thing about prototyping, whether it's mobile or web or computer or anywhere else, is to be okay with the idea of failing. And that's it. Thank you.